exhibit is from Exhibit Envoy, and it was curated by our guest, Amy Cohen, who is also the executive director of Exhibit Envoy. But I'd also like to mention the local aspect that we've included, the Vallejo aspect, includes these beautiful portraits that you'll have a chance to look at over here. And they were all taken by Stephen Jacobson, our very talented local photographer. Some of you know Stephen, and you know he does spectacular work, and we're lucky to have a number of very talented photographers in the community, but we're also very lucky to be able to work with Stephen to incorporate that into this exhibit. So I'll have a few things to say about that when we get around to that part of it. But in the meantime, Amy's going to do a walkthrough and talk a little bit more about the whole process and the background, and it's a fascinating exhibit. I hope you'll have a chance to look in more detail and read everything. And in the meantime, I'd like to introduce Amy Cohen.
Yay. So thank you again for coming, and thank you so much to Jim and the folks here at the museum for having me. This is, I think, my biggest crowd yet. Yay! So this is awesome. Thank you all for being here today. So I would like to start out just by asking who here, if you'd like to share, who here has tattoos themselves? Nice. Is anyone thinking about getting a tattoo? Good. And then lastly, who would never ever get a tattoo but is here today anyway? All right. Brave man for admitting that. Thank you. So I would like to formally welcome you to Tattooed and Tenacious. This actually started out in 2015. I was getting my master's in museum studies at JFK University in Berkeley. And instead of writing a paper, I thought, well, why not put together an exhibit? That's way more fun, and maybe someone else will want to read it. And so I'm really glad that the show has been now at its 10th venue here, which is really exciting. And I also want to give some credit to folks who helped me start this show. I was really lucky to get to work with Lyle Tuttle, who is a famous tattoo artist who recently passed away. And so he was able to give me some photographs, information on some of the women that we'll talk about here today. And it was really neat that he, Madame Chinchilla, a lot of other tattoo artists in California kind of took me under their wing and then helped me put this whole show together for you. So as we go through this, feel free to ask questions. You don't have to hold any questions to the end. Interrupt me. I'm sure people want to hear other voices, not just my own, during this, so feel free to ask away about any questions. So I think we'll start right at the beginning here. I know it might be a little bit hard to kind of all scoot together for this, but I have some handouts we'll pass around, so if you can, you know, just kind of hand them out and help other folks with it, that would be great. So to start this show, almost a quarter of American women have tattoos, which is actually more than American men. So it's pretty amazing, you know, we don't see tattoos on women maybe all the time. In some parts of the country, in some parts of the world, you know, it's still not something that people want to show or that is acceptable to show. But here in the US, and especially in California, lots of women have tattoos. And so I wanted to know where this all started. I thought this was a relatively new trend, and lo and behold, I was so wrong. There's a long history of tattooing in California. And so the first women, really, who did tattoo and who had tattoos in California were Native women. Almost every tribe had a tattooing tradition. A lot of tattoos were done on the chin, and so you could tell from the markings on the chin which tribe someone belonged to. So there were a lot of different reasons for this. There was no one set answer for why folks would get a tattoo in a tribe. Sometimes it was a puberty ritual. Sometimes it was so you could recognize descendants in the afterlife. Sometimes it was just to accentuate a feature. It was purely aesthetic. But something that's really interesting to me is that if you look at some of these photographs here, it's really hard to tell that they have tattoos, right? I mean, you can barely see the ink in both of these photographs. You have to get up really close to see it. And that's actually because the collodion wet plate process like washed out blue and green ink, especially on darker skin. And so that's something to consider as we're looking at some of these older photographs, and especially why I think there's a host of images of white women who have tattoos, but I wasn't able to find images from basically folks who are not white during this time period in California, and it's because those inks were kind of washed out in photographs. So I'm going to pass this around. Michael Bradley is an artist from New Zealand, I believe, and so he actually did a project with Maori people. And so you can see on one side is a digital image, and you can see the ink on their face, and on the other side is the traditional collodion process, and you can see it's totally washed out. So as we move through the exhibit, and I'll pass another one on this side, as you see photographs of folks in olden times, consider that there are a lot of cultural markers that may not be present in those photographs that actually were there at the time. So as we pass that around, we'll move kind of from the first woman who held the tattooing knowledge and the first woman in California to be tattooed to the first white woman that we know of in America that was tattooed. And this is Olive Oatman. Her story is really well documented. And so she was part of the Mormon sect of the Brewsterites, who moved from Illinois to Arizona. But along the way, Olive, who was 14 at the time, and her family were attacked by a Yavapai tribe. And so her mom, dad, and 7 of her siblings were left for dead. They were dead. And then her sister was taken with her, Marianne. Only one brother survived. She was essentially a slave to the tribe for about a year until she was traded to a Mojave tribe who really took her in and made her their own. So you can see here these distinctive chin tattoos that she has, and so that was given to her by her Mojave family. So essentially, she was there for a few years. She was taken out of her tribe by white soldiers who thought that it was inappropriate for her to be there when they finally found her, and then she had a really kind of tragic life after that. She never really felt accepted back into white society. She got her education, she helped publish a book about her story, and she did a speaking tour, but she never really got out of kind of a depression from where she was. And that's the great story of the first person, the first white woman that we know who has tattoos. And what's unique about her is that there are a lot of disputed reasons for why she had the tattoos. During her speaking tour, she would go from place to place, and in the book, she said that she was given the tattoos against her will. I think that, and some historians think that it's because it wasn't acceptable for her to say that she wanted the tattoos and that they were a sign of being a part of the tribe and being a part of the family. However, recently a tribal elder shared some notes on that and what he thought. And so a tribal elder, Llewellyn Barrickman, believed that Olive, like most Mojave females, chose to be tattooed because the tribe never forced tattoos on anyone. And some Mojaves resisted chin tattoos until they got older and were either persuaded or chose to get them for fear that they would be held back in the afterlife without them. And you can see if you get up close how straight the lines are. And so obviously she wasn't struggling during this process because there's no way with hand tattooing you could get a straight line like that if someone wasn't willing to cooperate. So that's kind of the sad start to white women in the West having tattoos, someone who wanted to have this tattoo and then was taken out of this society. It's a totally opposite story if we look at the wealthy women who wanted to get these tattoos later on. So you can see here, this is Amy Crocker. This is Lady Randolph Churchill, who was rumored to have a snake tattoo on her wrist. Ooh, it's Winston Churchill's mom. But you can see from up here, in 1897, the New York World reported the shocking fact that 75% of American society women have permanent ink. So there's no way that was true. I know this is a tabloid. But the fact that they're even reporting this means that there had to be a significant number of women who actually did have tattoos, and particularly elite society women who have them. So it's pretty amazing thinking in the 1890s that so many women were wearing tattoos and covered up. I mean, think of the clothing at the time. There were high necks, long sleeves, long skirts. Someone could have a tattoo and you would not even know it. If we look at Amy Crocker here, she was kind of an exception to the rule. Most society women hid their tattoos or only brought them out among friends. Amy Crocker was an eccentric, and she loved to show off all of her tattoos. I think that she's actually one of the most fascinating women in California history. Her full name is Princess Aimee. She changed it from Amy to Aimee, the French accent, because she didn't think Amy was interesting enough. Princess Aimee Isabella Crocker Ash Gillard Gorod Miskinov Galitzine. That's her full name. She had 5 husbands over the course of her life. 2 of them were Russian royalty, and they were both at least 20 years younger than her. She lived in Asia for 10 years, where she got most of her tattoos, and she was part of the Crocker Railroad fortune. So you know, the Crocker Art Museum, any of that, that's the same family. And her personal fortune, not her family's fortune, her personal fortune at the time was $10 million, which is $200 million today. Wow. So she kind of got away with doing whatever she wanted, including showing off her tattoos whenever she liked. So if you get up close here, and I encourage folks, if you want, like, feel free to look at photos and stuff while we're talking. She has a snake tattooed right here. My guess is that this was the same kind of collodion wet plate process as was happening with the folks in the native ink section, but because her skin is lighter, it's easier to see. But even so, it does still look pretty washed out in this photograph. But Amy Crocker threw lavish parties. She went to the first night of every Broadway opening. She was a world traveler, just an amazing woman. And the title of her autobiography kind of sums it up, which is And I Do It Again. It's back in print if folks are interested. From there, these wealthy women kind of gave way to tattooed ladies in the circus sideshow. And when I say tattooed ladies, that's really what I'm referring to, is folks who made a living as tattooed ladies on display in the freak show or sideshow in the circus circuits, traveling throughout the US and sometimes even across the world. So when you would get to a circus sideshow, just to kind of put the image in your mind, essentially you would walk down this path, which was full of these huge banners, 9 foot by 10 feet long, that would kind of tell you what you were going to see inside. So you would see tattooed ladies painted on the sideshow banners. You would see other, using the terminology of the time, freaks that you would see inside. I'm going to pass this around. Sorry, I'm so glad so many people are here today. I would have made more copies if I'd known. But you can see on this sideshow banner, picture this as 9 foot by 10 foot. Wow. And the alive button in the corner was really important, because that meant that you were going to see a tattooed lady who was actually alive, not dead and stuffed. Oh, yeah. So we'll start by passing this around.
That didn't exist. Did they really stuff real people?
No, they did. Yes.
They still have stuff?
No,
like
they
that
didn't
around?
stuff people. No, not anymore.
Like, that's not in somewhere?
You know, I'm
They
sure
did human
it could
taxidermy?
You know, this was a weird thing. It happened, and when people were, we don't need to go that far.
let's not go there.
That's a different exhibit. Exactly. Or not. So what happened with these tattooed ladies then was, because they were alive and people could talk to them, is they needed a story to sell for why they became a tattooed lady and to entice folks to come in and buy tickets. And so these women who got tattooed, they did it because it was actually pretty good living. It was an opportunity to travel and to live an independent life, which was not otherwise readily available to women in the 1880s, which is when the first tattooed ladies came on the circuit. So to put this in context, a working class family at that time would make $300 to $500 a year, and a tattooed lady could make $100 to $200 in a week. Wow. Yeah, so there was a lot of incentive to get tattooed beyond just getting to live your own life and travel. You were making some money as well. And you weren't working every single week of the year, but you were doing okay.
What was the show like? Did they just talk to the audience?
Yeah, folks just kind of walked through a tent, from my understanding, and there would be people standing on platforms or near them, and they would kind of look at the oddity, and it's not like someone could look on the internet or just watch a movie and see folks from other places. Folks with some disabilities were in there. It was just like not really a nice thing, I'm sure. But it was definitely a big attraction when the circus came to town. It wasn't just the big top; it was the sideshow. And so there were kind of these two eras. of stories that these women told as folks were walking through or to get them into the tent in the first place. So the first era of tattooed ladies was in the early 1880s through the 1890s. And a lot of the stories they told reflected what society was interested in. So at this point, it was the American West. So these women, remember, these are false stories. They're making all of this up. Told these narratives about Native Americans and being in the West. So I'm going to pass around some pictures, and I would love to tell you stories of two women who did not make it in the exhibit because they don't have a California connection, but they're fascinating, and they're the first two tattooed ladies that we know of in America. So I have this written down because it's a story. So the first woman is Nora Hildebrandt. So I'll pass this one around here, and they're labeled on the back too, so if you get it later, you can know who she is. So I'll start this one here. And before I tell this story, I would like to just remind folks that in Victorian coded language, they used a lot of terms that were, innocuous on the surface, but really meant something else underneath, so that polite society could still talk about these things. So tattooing was kind of an illusion for sex, and so forced tattooing was an illusion for rape. Tattooing by a family member was incest, so just keep this in mind as I tell these stories. Well, remember, these are stories told to titillate people and get them into the sideshow. So Nora Hildebrandt, whose picture is being passed around, was tattooed by her father under threat of death of Sitting Bull, because of course you need to have a famous name in there, right?
When you say illusion, you mean like code or like what?
Coded language. Yeah. So when someone like a sideshow barker would say, like, meet this woman who got tattooed by her father, the audience would have that kind of extra element of scintillating, like, ooh, tattooed by her father. Oh, that's incest, So, I know, yeah. It's fascinating. So her father, Martin, and Nora were captured by Sitting Bull, and Martin was told to tattoo members of the tribe. When a warrior accused Martin of poisoning him, Sitting Bull said he would give them liberty only if Martin tattooed his daughter, Nora, from her toes to her head. She was tied to a tree where Martin began to work for 6 hours a day for a year until they were rescued. So that's a story they would have heard. Yeah. In reality, Martin Hildebrandt was Nora's husband. He was one of the first tattoo artists in New York. I believe he was a German immigrant. And they had never even been to the West. They had only been in New York City for most of their life. Another one, Irene Woodward, here, pass around this way. Another of the first tattooed ladies. Her story was that she was tattooed by her father to prevent her from being kidnapped when she was growing up in the West. And a quote from her story, which was published in newspapers and pamphlets ahead of time to try and entice folks to come on out to the sideshow, was that when her father tattooed her, quote, in spite of the pain, the girl was delighted and coaxed her father to continue. So when she was captured, her tattoos frightened the savages and they let her go free. So again, Irene Woodward got tattooed to make money. But those are the kinds of stories that the tattooed ladies were putting out there and that folks were hearing about them and their tattoos. The second era of tattoos, though, which is what we'll kind of see here when we look at these images of Betty Broadbent and Artoria and Lady Viola, is that these were all happening in the 1910s and 20s, and their stories were all about love and independence and becoming their own people. So it's fascinating to see how society's interests kind of changed and what they wanted to know about. So an example is Jean Carroll, whose story that she told was she was a bearded lady in the circus whose boyfriend couldn't bear to kiss her. So she shaved her beard and got tattooed, and then she got married and worked on the circuit, right? Artoria, that lady there with the feathers from her hair, her story was that she ran away with a carnival tattoo artist to be his muse because she was in love. Lady Viola, the champion tattooed woman of the world, her story was that she would train to be a nurse, and if she completed her schooling, her dad would pay for her tattoos. She completed her schooling, and then Dad paid for the tattoos, and she worked on the sideshow. So again, all these ladies got tattooed to make money, to be independent, to travel. But it's fascinating what kinds of stories they told folks to entice them to come into the sideshow.
What was happening in Europe at that time? And was this something unique to the States, or?
That is a great question. I'm not really sure. I do know that some of these ladies did travel overseas with part of their groups. So like Betty Broadbent here, who I'll talk about a little bit more, started with the Ringling Brothers in 1927, and she traveled internationally with them. So I'm not sure if Europe had their own version of sideshows or not, but I do know that American troops did often go over there and perform. Another thing to notice with these tattooed ladies is they all chose their designs. So as we start to look, especially at these later era ladies, you can see that they chose images that were important to them. So Lady Viola was very patriotic. So she had 6 presidents tattooed on her chest and the U.S. Capitol on her back. And here's another image of Lady Viola. We had Artoria Gibbons, who's in that photo there, but this is a much clearer one. She had the Last Supper tattooed on her back. And there are actually 3 images that I know of where women had the Last Supper fully tattooed as a back piece, which is pretty amazing. So if you get up closer here, you can see a couple of those examples. And so it's pretty cool that not only did these women, make their own career for themselves and they made their own path in life, they were actually representing what was important to them on their bodies in a way that maybe other folks at the time didn't even recognize when they saw them in public, with, again, long sleeves, long pants, right? My favorite tattooed lady, though, is Betty Broadbent, who's right here. I just think that she is so cool. She had 350 tattoos, estimated, and she got her first tattoo at the age of 14. But what I really love is that in 1939, she competed in a televised beauty pageant to challenge the conventional standards of beauty. Wow. And that was explicitly expressed by her. This is not me putting my, feminist theory onto her. She actually said that was why she participated. Unfortunately, she did not win. But I love that she was up there on the stage with everyone, and you can see, she was very clearly showing her tattoos, and it worked out well.
That's a lot of leg.
I know, right? 1939, yeah. And something that you'll see as we're looking at some of these images of tattooed ladies is that the costumes that they wore were very clearly very feminine and kind of flouncy and frilly or very well put together. And so these tattooed ladies wore those kinds of costumes, especially for their promotional photographs, because they wanted to show that women with tattoos could be beautiful and be feminine as well. So really trendsetters in a lot of ways. So Betty worked in San Francisco for many years. She was not only a tattooed lady, but a tattoo artist. Artoria Gibbons over here was also a tattoo artist. You can see which section we're heading to now, right? Lady Viola was also a tattoo artist who actually worked in Fresno with her 9 children. I know, it's pretty amazing. And then, yeah, I think, are we ready to talk about tattoo artists? Yeah? Okay, cool. So we're going to actually head back towards that direction now, where it says learning the trade. And you'll see Maud Wagner's picture next to you. This is probably one of the most recognizable images that we see when we think of women in tattoos. This is Maud Stevens Wagner. She was photographed here in 1904, if you can believe it. And I'm going to pass around a picture of her with her husband Gus and her baby Lanova, who we'll talk about later. But you can see no tattoos again in this photo, except for one little piece on Gus's wrist, right there. Can people hear me enough? Okay, that's okay. I can talk louder.
Please do.
Okay. So it was really difficult for women to break into the tattooing trade. While they supplanted tattooed men, who were actually the first ones on the circus sideshow circuit, because, people are going to pay money to see a scantily clad lady more than a scantily clad man, getting into the trade was tough. And so a lot of these women who were the first tattooers in California learned because a husband or a boyfriend taught them. So that was the case with the tattooed ladies back there. Most of them were married to tattoo artists, and that's who taught them how to tattoo. And Maud was no different. She was a circus contortionist and aerialist, who, the story goes, was asked out on a date by Gus Wagner. She said, okay, but only if you teach me how to tattoo. So the story goes, he taught her how to tattoo. They traveled together in the circus. They both tattooed people, and they both worked on the circus sideshow as tattooed a tattooed man and a tattooed lady. They also had a daughter, Ladaba, and we'll see some of her work later in the show. But it's pretty neat that they're one of the first tattooing families that we know of, and they spent a lot of time in LA. So they are California folks, at the end of their life. And one reason a lot of these women who did work as tattoo ladies also learned how to tattoo was it was just another source of income. So if you only worked on the sideshow for a couple of weeks, you could set up shop during the winter months when people were not paying to come out into the circus, make some money there, keep living, tattoo other people at the circus, get them up on the stage and go from there. So, we continue moving along. We'll see some other tattooed tattoo artists who were ladies. And the reason that I kind of call them tattooists instead of tattoo artists at first is because this was still a pretty rudimentary art form. There were not a lot of colors, that were available. The tattoo machine, which we still use today, had been patented. It was in use, but it still wasn't super refined. And so you can see from this flash here, or otherwise known as pre-drawn designs flash, that this is from actually the 50s, and it's still pretty basic. So I'm really excited, that the folks here in Vallejo have shown where the art form has come from after this point. But that's why, as you go through the exhibit, you'll read tattooist in the text panels rather than tattoo artist. It was still more of a profession to get you by rather than a profession to express your own artwork. Thank you. Yeah.
So the tattoos from the 19th century, were they mostly black and white, or did they have color in them?
That's a great question. Most of them at first started with just black ink, or just blue, or just green, based on if you were, using a tribal tradition or using commercially available inks. Eventually, they added in red and blue. And I think yellow was an issue because it poisoned people. I have to review my stats on that one. It might have been a different color, but it was either yellow or red that was really hard to get on the skin without folks succumbing to poison. Yes, right. That would make sense. Yeah, with mercury. But eventually, there were more and more colors that became available. Technology improved, and then you can see, especially when you look at those tattooed ladies from the 20s. The line works a lot better. There's a lot more detail. They had more color, even though, of course, we can't tell with the black and white. But yeah, it's interesting to see that progression. And even if you look at Maud Wagner there, you can see that the black lines are really thick and heavy compared to what was later possible. So Dainty Dottie here actually worked with her husband, who I've never been able to find a photograph of him, which is too bad. But they actually both worked in the circus as well. And Dainty Dottie, when she would be in the sideshow, was the fat lady. So that's how she got her name, Dainty Dottie. But this is actually her artwork that was up on the wall of her shop. And you can see, if you look closely, the prices for each of the tattoos that she was willing to do. So this one was $6, this was $5.50, $8.50 for that one. So it was kind of cheap still then, you might have to save up a little bit, but there was no problem with, if you're a sailor, you get off at the dock, you get this done, and then you go out on the town, right? For context, the tattoo artist that I go to the most, her rate per hour is $200 plus tip. So you can kind of think about how cheap this was, and also it's reflective of the skill involved for these compared to a lot of the tattoos that we see today. Yes.
Yours.
Oh, yes, thank you.
I once read that the seamen, depending on if they crossed the Pacific or Atlantic, would get certain tattoos. Are there any other things like that where, trades or people in trades?
The most interesting story that I've heard was actually from New York, Buffalo, New York. So again, this show's about California, so it didn't make it in. But lesbian women in Buffalo, New York in the 50s would get a blue star tattooed on their wrist, so it would go under their wristwatch strap. And so that way folks could recognize each other when they were out without having to ask a question.
Amazing.
Yeah, so there
Just
were,
in Buffalo. It wasn't a trend.
as far as I know, it was just
What
in
was it?
Buffalo.
What kind of women?
Lesbian
Oh,
women.
is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so it was their way to be, to safely recognize each other. And so I'm sure there are a lot of other,
Codes.
ways, that tattoos
That's
have
a
been
tender
used like
area
that.
that might have hurt too, right?
Yeah. Yeah, if you've never been tattooed before, if you just pinch yourself a couple of times, you can kind of get the idea, but just, times that by an hour and where you get tattooed. If it's on your elbow, if it's by bone, it's going to hurt a lot more. For me, this part really hurt the most, like near the fat of my upper arm. But, every person is different and, pain tolerance, it's really not that bad if you're thinking about getting one. Yeah.
Personally, how did as you're going through this, putting this exhibit together, how did it affect you? Did you get different tattoos, more tattoos?
That is a great question. I did not get, I did get one more tattoo because of the exhibit, which I'll share at the end. But for me, what was really exciting was just knowing that I was part of this tradition, this long tradition of women getting tattoos that I just did not know about before. And it made me feel a lot more connected to that history, and I'm a historian by trade. So that was really exciting for me to know that this wasn't like a new modern trend. Women have been getting tattoos since forever. And, it's just nice because I did get a lot of pushback from folks. My first tattoo, this little Leonard Cohen drawing right there. I had told, it's from the Book of Longing, the cover, if anyone's a Leonard Cohen fan. I had told my dad I was going to get it. I was a senior in college, and I was really excited. I was gung-ho, and he said, well, only bikers and rebels have tattoos. So. You don't have a motorcycle, so you must be a rebel. And working on this show years later, it was really nice to know that there have been women who've been getting tattoos for years. The reasons are different. Maybe they change over time, but I'm part of a tradition. Especially in California, there's a long tattoo culture history here.
Can it be rather addictive too?
Some people have said so. It has not been for me. For my process, it's probably going to sound a little silly, but I overthink everything. And so I tend to think about what tattoo I want for so long that at a certain point I wake up in the morning and I look down and I'm surprised it's not on me. And that's when I know that it's time to get the tattoo. Other folks, they just come up with the design ideas for the moment, or they just decide they want something and they go into a shop and get it. And neither one is better than the other. The important thing is that you are happy with the choice that you made.
But even maybe the pain is pleasure, pleasure is pain aspect of it, even if it's just a tiny.
I've heard that for some folks. That hasn't been my experience. Yeah.
We've had a lot of sailors over the years in Vallejo, and I'm wondering if you know anything about the women who were tattoo artists in Vallejo.
I actually don't know that much about women in Vallejo tattooing then. What I mostly found was that San Francisco, San Diego, and LA had the most women tattooing before World War II. Some were really great at what they were doing. They had clean shops. Others, not so much. There's a woman called Painless Nell who would use the same bucket of soap and water to clean the needles in between sailors down in San Diego. And so, I'm sure there were, that's kind of an aside, I guess. But yeah, I'm sure that there were women tattooing up here, and Doc Webb was a tattooer up here as well, who's very famous. And Jim.
Well, if I could just jump in and give a plug for our program next week.
Yes.
We'll have one of Vallejo's women tattoo artists here to talk about, Red Jeannie, talk about tattooing body, mind, and spirit and the connection. But she's been a woman tattooist here in Vallejo for quite a number of years, and I think she'll address that subject a little bit more. So you can come back next week for another interesting program.
Yeah.
What time's the games?
Yeah, what time is it? Depends on who's in the game, right?
But speaking of women and their shops, a lot of women had to hide who was actually tattooing at the shop when they made advertisements. So Maud Stevens Wagner would advertise under the name M. Stevens Wagner to get folks into the shop, because not everyone wanted to get tattooed by a lady. However, working with Lyle Tuttle, I found out about Madame Austin, who was one of, I'd never heard of her. I hadn't read about her in any of the secondary sources I used, but this is her photo, and as far as I know and as far as Lyle knew, this is the first time this photo had ever been shared outside of his personal collection was in this exhibit, which is very cool. And so we think that she is the lady tattoo artist who's mentioned in this ad, which again was very rare. It was not common to see any lady advertising that they were actually a female tattoo artist because they would get so many less customers. So it's very neat that she advertised this way, we think, and she worked in San Francisco in a shop with a lot of other well-regarded male tattoo artists. Ruth Wayland was also a tattoo artist who worked in San Francisco. And you'll see all these tattoos on her. They were actually added onto a photograph that was taken, and she did not have tattoos like that. So this photo is super doctored. I'm not actually sure what tattoos she had, if any. But this is an example of her work. She was really well known for tattooing kind of overtly lesbian imagery, so that also kind of tells you about who her clients were in San Francisco.
Wow.
This is a design from 1933. So again, you would never see that on someone walking around. They weren't wearing a deep V-neck, you know, so all these women who had tattoos that weren't shown, it's kind of amazing to think about how many people walking around that day and age actually did have tattoos. She also loved tattooing sailors. Again, lots of her clients in San Francisco were sailors, and she called them the gems of the earth, which I think is very sweet. And so the last tattoo artist we'll talk about is Ladova Wagner. So remember we were talking about Maud in that picture over there. Ladova actually was also a tattoo artist in LA in her own right. However, she never had any tattoos herself. Her mother, Maud, had forbidden her from getting tattoos. I don't really know why, because Maud had so many, Gus had so many. And eventually she relented after the passing of Ladova's father, Gus. And at that point she said, well, my dad can't tattoo me, and like, I can't get his work, then I don't want anyone's work. So she's one of the only tattoo artists that I know that was working them that had no tattoos themselves. But she did a lot of religious imagery, as you can see. But if you look at the difference between some of the tattoos that the women had early on, moving up to here, which is in the 40s and 50s, I mean, you can see a difference in the style already. And I'll say, from my end, I'm a historian, not an artist. So when I talk about different art styles, and I'll take that with a grain of salt. I know more about the history. But I think you can see a pretty clear difference as you look at this. And so that kind of brings us up to the end of my part of the exhibits. In the 50s, there was kind of a decline in tattoos. Like outlaw gangs and biker gangs and folks in prison really started getting tattoos and using that as a signifier for themselves and for the groups they belong to. And so nowadays when we hear these kind of bad raps that tattoos have, that's really where a lot of that came from. There wasn't that same kind of disgust associated with tattoos even in like the 1890s, you know, or the 1900s. But then of course, in the late 60s, another tattoo revolution started. Janis Joplin had a tattoo. So that's actually how I got connected to Lyle, because he did that tattoo. So you can see a little picture of her here. And then as the feminist movement emerged in the 70s, you know, it was again, you get a tattoo, it's another way to reclaim your body and to show who you are in a way that maybe wasn't seen as acceptable 20 years prior. And today, tattoos are more popular than ever, but I'm very curious to know what will happen in the future. I can't imagine that children of folks who are heavily tattooed, you know, will want to do exactly the same thing. They will rebel and get no tattoos instead. So we'll have to see how long and how tattoos' popularity changes. And then this is the last piece here. I wanted to make sure that there was a representation for those venues that did not augment the show like they did so beautifully here in Vallejo, to show what women were tattooing like today. Because if the last thing you see, you know, is this or Dainty Dottie's work, I didn't want people to walk out thinking that women were rudimentary tattooers still. And you can see from this, there's some amazing artists in the Bay. The show originally opened in Hayward, so we had some local artists from Hayward and other parts of the Bay participate and draw and paint and do whatever they wanted to body parts of the mannequin. And the story I was going to share about the tattoo I got based on this exhibit's a little nerdy. But one woman, Carolyn, did a great tattoo. Oh, where is it? There we go. On the inside of the arm. I forget where it is on the mannequin. So you can see this wreath right here, and it has a little design in there. She did this for the exhibit. And it was one of those that I couldn't stop thinking about, and I woke up one morning, surprised it wasn't on me. And so then, so I matched a little bit on the back there. I have a different inside, photograph, but, that's my nerdy story for, not only cool people get tattoos. Yes.
This is great. Looking at this, it seems like it was primarily a white phenomenon. So where do women of color fit into this?
That's what I was really bummed out about, to be honest, when I was doing this research, is I could not find much information. And there's no way that it was only white women doing this. And so if I had the ability to go back and really dive into this research, that's what I would want to look for. Because again, a little bit with that wet plate process in early history, it's easier to see tattoos on white women than tattoos on people with darker skin. But yeah, people of color, there's a lot more documentation starting after the 60s or so, but my exhibit only went up to the, really World War II is kind of where I ended it, and I just couldn't find the information that I was looking for. But it's a great question. I know that's something that's really missing from this exhibit. So I would love to turn it over to Jim, who's going to share more about the Vallejo portion of the exhibit.
All right, well, I'd like to thank Amy for an excellent presentation.
Oh, thanks so much for listening.
And I'd also like to mention that we're glad to have this exhibit here, the traveling portion of the exhibit, and our ability to add some of the local dimensions as well as put on some of these special programs, because we received a grant from the Vallejo Commission on Culture and the Arts, and administered through the Vallejo Community Arts Foundation. So it's thanks to that grant that we were really able to bring this here and to expand it to what you see here today. So I really want to acknowledge the generosity of the Commission on Culture and the Arts. And I mentioned that we do have several other programs. Next Saturday, January 18th, Jeannie Tyre, Red Jeannie, is going to be talking about connecting mind, body, and spirit through tattoos. And then on February 1st, we have a program on Filipino tattooing traditions, which is certainly appropriate for Vallejo, and also maybe helps fill in some of those gaps that you mentioned about the communities of color. And finishing off on February 15th with a panel discussion on California Indian and Native American tattooing traditions and practices. So there are some of these flyers on the table over there, or also out on the front desk. So help yourself to one of those flyers, or keep an eye on the museum's website and Facebook page, and please try to spread the word about some of these other very interesting programs. So Amy did a presentation at a conference, the California Association of Museums, about a year ago, and specifically talking about when this exhibit was up in Yuba City. And Yuba City, of course, is much more rural compared to Vallejo, probably a little bit, or considerably more conservative than Vallejo. And you mentioned some of the resistance that maybe came from the community or from some of the folks with the museum up there. And I'm happy to say that we saw none of that at all here in Vallejo. In fact, people were just so excited when they heard about this exhibit. This is going to be great for Vallejo. We have, I was just saying to Jim Rakowski, you can't hardly turn and throw a stone in Vallejo without hitting a tattoo shop. So, it's a great tradition. And of course, part of that is because of our Navy tradition here in Vallejo. And so that's really something that is not specific to women in tattooing, but part of our community, and going back probably as long as the Navy has been here. And so we were able to add some local dimension to the exhibit. A couple of the things over here, this talks specifically about Doc Webb, who was a well-known tattooist. Those of you who read the Vallejo Times-Herald saw a very interesting article by Brendan Riley about a month ago about Doc Webb, and gave a nice plug for this exhibit. But here's a picture of Doc Webb, very famous tattooist. Some of the flash, the tattoo designs that he used, and even a picture of what his tattoo shop here in Vallejo purportedly looked like. So we wanted to include Doc Webb. He was in Vallejo for a brief period of time. He was also up in Seattle, is that correct?
Seattle, Alaska.
And Alaska, then it ended up in San Diego, and so he was all up and down the West Coast, but obviously you can see the demand here in Vallejo as a Navy town, so he did operate for a number of years here in Vallejo. And interestingly enough, the sign up above, some of you may know Paul Beeman, retired judge here in Vallejo, but he's a Vallejo native and grew up here. And as you probably also know, a large part of downtown Vallejo was torn down in the early 60s during the redevelopment era, and when all of the colorful Lower Georgia Street neighborhood went away as a result of that, Paul Beeman pulled this sign out of some of the rubble of one of the old buildings that had been torn down. He had it for years and years, and finally came down to the museum and said, you know, I think this really belongs in the museum instead of in my house. And so that's why we were able to get that. But you can see the condition it's in, and you just have to think about what all was lost in Vallejo when all of that colorful part of our downtown was destroyed 50, 60 years ago. But, you know, little bits of it survived. So, so we're happy to have this part about Doc Webb's tattoo studio. Another thing that is very interesting, it ties in with tattooing in Vallejo, is at the Mare Island Hospital, and specifically what they called the brace shop, which is where they did pioneering work with prosthetic limbs, particularly during World War II when sailors, Marines, whatever came back from the Pacific, injured in the war, many had lost limbs. They did a lot of this pioneering work with artificial limbs. And so here's a picture of the brace shop at Mare Island, with a sailor with an artificial limb, and the actress Merle Oberon, very popular at that time. You know, here is a patriotic, or you know, to generate enthusiasm about the patriotic work that Mare Island was doing. And so we chose this picture just because it includes her, and it's a good picture of what the brace shop was doing. But the Mare Island Museum also loaned us this artificial leg from the 1940s, and it has a tattoo decal on it. And we don't know that much about it. They got it from someone who was doing a clean out of a house. That, you know, a lot of times at the house, the people move out, they pass away, whatever, and someone's called in to clean out the house, and he found this.
So
but
it wasn't
apparently,
Doc Webb. That's not Doc
it's
Webb.
not. No, it's not Doc Webb. We don't know who it is, but it is. It's just a decal applied to the artificial limb. But apparently, this soldier, Marine, whoever it was, probably had other tattoos, and said, you know, darn it, I might have lost my leg, but I'm not going to lose my tattoo. So he had that done on his artificial leg. So it's kind of an interesting, you know, again, an interesting local aspect to it. If you look real carefully up on the top, it says U.S. Naval Hospital, Mare Island, right on there. So we know positively that that is really a local connection. They do know that it was found in a house up on Star Avenue. So we might be able to do a little bit more research and find out who lived there over the years, and maybe trace it back to a specific person. But that would be interesting if we could do it. So the other part of this exhibit is that we wanted to talk about Vallejo women, and we were, as I say, very fortunate to work with Stephen Jacobson and a good friend of mine, Heather Blithely, who has a number of tattoos. And I just mentioned that this exhibit was coming. I mentioned it to Heather, and can you get some other people involved? Would you be interested in being involved? She said, oh yeah, absolutely, I'm there, you know. So pretty much just through word of mouth, we contacted these 21, I believe, Vallejo women. We had more, actually. We wouldn't have had room to show all of them, or really time to do all the photo sessions that we did to include all of the people who expressed interest. But it was all pretty much through word of mouth. And people were contacting us and reaching out and wanting to participate. And all different styles, all different ages, all different reasons for wanting to get these tattoos. And if you look all the way at the end of the first row here, and also in this little booklet, we asked the women, you know, what's your favorite tattoo? Who did the artwork? Who did the tattooing? And does it have any significance to you? And so we've collected some of those stories here, where the women talk about, you know, why this particular design. We didn't even include all of them, but what some of the significance was to some of these tattoos. And the reasons are as varied as the different kind of tattoo designs you can get. But it's interesting to read. Some are whimsical, some very, very serious, and a whole variety of different reasons why these tattoos were chosen. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I really don't know all of the stories, but I would want to mention that we had 3 photo sessions set up where we did these photos. One of them, if you remember back in October, We had a disastrous weekend where all the power was shut down because of the windstorms. That was also the same weekend that there was a fire along the Carquinez Straits. It jumped over to Crockett, and it burned on both sides of the toll plaza. And one of these women was coming from San Francisco and had to drive through all of that. It was like literally, disaster. And when I left home early in the morning, off of Redwood Street, all the power was out. Coming down Sonoma Boulevard, all the power was out. I thought, well, I need to go to the museum and see if we have power, because otherwise I got to start getting on the phone. And I came around the corner right up here at Carolina Street, all the power was out. And the museum was in this little island in the middle of all of that was going on, and we had power. Now, some of the women couldn't make it because they didn't have power at home, but we were able, and Stephen, we were able to, despite all of that, do the whole photo session. And then we did one more after that in early December, so we were right up against it to try to get all this done in time. But the portraits are beautiful, the tattoos are beautiful. I think you can just take a look and see all of these portraits and learn a little bit more by reading the book about who these women are. And there were so many that we just couldn't include the full-size portraits. So Stephen also created these flashboards over there showing some of the different close-ups of the different designs that a number of these women have. I'm just going to point out one in particular because this woman here, her name is Kayla Orpelia. Some of you may know Mel Orpelia here in Vallejo, is very active in the Filipino community. This is Mel's niece, and she has a traditional Filipino design, but she is, as far as we know, the first Filipino woman in more than 100 years to have that traditional Filipino tattooing done. And Mel is going to be doing a program here, as I mentioned, on February 1st, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that, about why that's so unique, why it was a tradition among Filipino women, and how it was lost, but it's now coming back. So, as I say, the stories are as varied as the different women and their lives. And so, I'm glad you were all able to come out today. I'm glad to answer any questions that you might have. Stephen may also be able to do that, or Amy. And thank you all for coming out. And please spread the word and have people come back to the other programs. And enjoy the exhibit, which runs through February 29th. So it's only here for 2 months, January, February. But we really want to get the word out and let people know about this fantastic exhibit. So thank you all again for coming.